This AI is capable of learning much faster than any organic intelligence, but it would have to be taught.
Artificial intelligence.
This program is made possible by financial support from viewers like you.
This is Babbling On and Babble On, brought to you by Bible and a Bicycle.
Welcome to the ride.
Rolling through the ruins where the old kings fell. Talking giants, watching secret scripture tells. Shadows in the desert, prophecy in the wind. But Yeshua is the banner that we ride under again.
Welcome, or welcome back, to Babbling On in Babylon. My name is Will, and I'm an aspirant follower of Yeshua HaMashiach. You might know him as Jesus Christ. And this here is where we're going to step outside the noise, outside the polished narratives, outside the corporate language, the headlines, and we start looking at the world underneath all that. Not the version that gets packaged for convenience, not the version that gets simplified for mass consumption, but the version that is actually built out of physical systems, real infrastructure, real energy consumption, real land use, and real consequences that most people never directly see, even though they interact with the end result of those systems every single day of their lives. And today we're starting a deep dive into artificial intelligence once again. But this time, before we go anywhere near the hype, before we get anywhere near the fear narratives, before we get anywhere near the philosophical or spiritual interpretations that people tend to jump to when they hear the term AI, we need to ground something very basic. We need to ground what this thing actually is in the physical world. Because one of the most powerful illusions of modern life is not technological. It's linguistic. It is the way language is used to separate the user experience of technology from the physical reality that makes it possible. And one of the clearest examples of that illusion is something almost everybody uses every single day nowadays without even thinking about it or even knowing about it. The phrase, the cloud. Now, when most people hear the cloud, they don't picture anything physical. They don't picture machinery, they don't picture buildings, they don't picture infrastructure. They don't picture electricity consumption or land use or cooling systems or anything like that. They picture something almost natural, something soft, something atmospheric, something weightless. Like data is floating somewhere above the earth in a kind of invisible layer that just exists on its own, separate from the physical world, separate from geography, separate from resources, and separate from constraint. And that mental image is extremely powerful because it removes friction from the imagination. It makes everything feel effortless. It makes everything feel like it simply exists without any cost. But that image is not real. There is no cloud. And I don't mean that metaphorically in a cute way. I mean it literally in terms of physical structure. What exists instead are buildings, large industrial buildings, data centers, facilities that, from the outside, often look like warehouses, manufacturing plants, or distribution centers. Big, flat, secure structures placed in carefully selected geographic locations for very specific logistical reasons. And inside those buildings, there is nothing abstract happening. There are machines, rows upon rows of server racks, stacked in metal frames, arranged in long aisles, designed for one purpose: continuous computation. These machines are not decorative. They are not idle. They are not passive storage units sitting quietly in a room. They are active systems, constantly processing instructions, constantly moving data, constantly reading, writing, calculating, routing, compressing, decompressing, indexing, and executing digital operations at massive scale. And all of that activity produces something very important that most people never think about when they interact with digital systems: heat. Heat is not a side effect you can ignore. Heat is a fundamental byproduct of computation. Every operation consumes energy, and every consumption of energy produces heat. And when you scale that up to the level of modern digital infrastructure, when you scale it to the level of global cloud systems, artificial intelligence systems, streaming systems, communication systems, you are no longer dealing with small amounts of heat. You are dealing with industrial heat output, which means you are no longer dealing with simple consumer electronics. You are dealing with industrial infrastructure. And industrial infrastructure requires industrial support systems. Which brings us to electricity. Because none of this runs on imagination. It runs on power. Massive, continuous, carefully managed electrical power. Electricity has to be generated somewhere, in power plants, in energy grids, through a mix of generation sources depending on the region: coal, natural gas, nuclear, hydro, wind, solar, and hybrid systems. That electricity then has to be transmitted across long distances through high voltage transmission lines. Oh Tesla, where are you now, Sir Nikolai? It has to pass through substations. It has to be stepped down, regulated, stabilized, and delivered into facilities that require extremely consistent and reliable power input. Because data centers and AI systems cannot simply turn off when power fluctuates. They require stability. They require redundancy. They require backup systems. They require generators. They require multiple layers of infrastructure designed to prevent interruption. So, when you zoom out from the user experience, what looks like a simple digital interaction is actually supported by an enormous physical chain. Generation, transmission, conversion, consumption, cooling, stabilization, redundancy, and then maintenance. And all of that exists simultaneously just to support what appears on your screen as an instant response. That disconnect is where the illusion begins. because the experience of using technology feels immediate. It feels weightless. It feels like it happens somewhere else. Magical. So the mind naturally assumes that somewhere else must also be lightweight. But that is not how physical systems work, folks. If something is happening at scale, it's happening somewhere physically, and it is using resources. It is occupying space. It is generating heat. It is drawing power. It is interacting with infrastructure. There is no exception to that rule. And yet modern language tends to obscure that reality. We say cloud computing instead of industrial computing infrastructure distributed across data centers. We say the cloud stores your data instead of your data is stored in energy-intensive server facilities housed in physical buildings that require constant power and cooling. We say AI generates responses instead of large-scale computational systems running on specialized hardware clusters process input using significant electrical and thermal resources to produce output. The language simplifies reality to the point where the physical structure disappears from imagination entirely. And once something disappears from imagination, it also tends to disappear from perceived consequence. That's where things become important. You remember that the greatest trick that the devil ever performed was convincing the world that he didn't exist, disappears from the imagination. Because AI is not reducing physical demand, it is increasing it. More usage means more computation. More computation means more servers. More servers means more electricity demand. More electricity demand means more strain on power grids. More strain on power grids means more infrastructure expansion, more planning, more construction, more negotiation with local systems. And all of that has to happen somewhere. Which brings us to a reality that most people do not immediately connect to their daily digital life. These systems are not located in abstract space. They are located in specific regions, specific communities, specific geographic zones that have been selected based on land availability, energy infrastructure, water access, regulatory environments, and logistical feasibility. Which means that the invisible digital world is actually anchored very firmly into the physical geography of this physical world. And most people never see that anchor point directly. They only see the result, the interface, the output, the convenience, the speed, the illusion of instant access to something that feels like it exists everywhere and nowhere at the same time. But it does not exist everywhere and nowhere. It exists somewhere very specific. And those somewheres are becoming more important as artificial intelligence systems scale up. Because AI systems require significantly more computational power than traditional digital services. They require more processing, more storage, more throughput, more cooling, more energy. which means the physical footprint of AI is not small. It is expanding, and that expansion is not theoretical. It is visible in construction projects. It is visible in energy planning. It is visible in land use decisions. It is visible in infrastructure development, even if it's not always visible in everyday awareness. And that is where this conversation begins. Not with fear, not with hype, not with speculation, but with recognition that the digital world is not separate from the physical world. It is built inside it, and it is growing inside it. Simply put, folks, these AI databases are everywhere, and they're growing like a cancer in many local communities, poisoning the water, the air, the very ground itself. And that's what we're gonna dig into tonight. So grab your Bibles, get you some refreshments, maybe even a snack or two. This could get lengthy. Pardon me if I use these big old 50-cent words. I'll try to bring it back around and simplify it before the day's over. But when in Rome, do as the Romans do, eh? Except for that sinning part. Alrighty, let's get into it.
Are you tired of carrying the weight of the world? Do you suffer from chronic hopelessness, persistent guilt, or an unshakable sense that something is missing?
Introducing the Bible, the time-tested, soul-approved solution to the human condition. Not just another book, but a revolutionary life treatment backed by thousands of years of divine research. The Bible works naturally with your heart and mind to reveal your purpose, provide peace, and even reconnect you with your Creator. Side effects may include sudden outbursts of joy, unexplainable hope in dark circumstances, increased compassion and patience, talking to God like He's actually listening. He is. Freedom from fear, guilt, and shame. Radical forgiveness of others and yourself. Occasional moments of, wow, I really needed to hear that. A burning desire to love your neighbor, even if they play the drums at midnight. Not recommended for people who enjoy holding grudges, hate being challenged, or insist on being their own God. Results may vary, but eternal life is guaranteed with regular use. Consult your Creator before starting a Bible regimen. Side effects increase with prayer. The Bible. Ask your soul if it's right for you.
We're tuning in tonight, where the truth and the rumors collide in the light. From prophecy to mystery, we got it going on. Welcome to the sound of Babylon. Babbling on in Babylon. The stories keep rolling, the beat goes on. From shadows deep to the break of dawn, we keep babbling, babbling on. Flip the page, ancient words on the mic. Conspiracies keep rolling, the beat goes on. From shadows deep to the break of dawn, we keep babbling, babbling on. Flip the page, ancient words on the mic. Conspiracies, prophecies, ride through the night. From heart to the heavens, the signs in the sky. Asking the questions they don't want you to try. Truth ain't clean, it's a puzzle and a fight. But we crack it wide open when the time is right. Whispers in the dark, voices in the dawn. Welcome to the chaos, Babylon. Babbling on in Babylon. The stories keep rolling, the beat goes on. From shadows deep to the break of dawn, we keep babbling, babbling on.
Alright, welcome back for those of you that stuck around. I know this is a little different than what we usually do here as far as the subject matter goes. I reckon you came here expecting some kind of big old woo-ha conspiracy theory, UFOs, elite hidden cults, or half-breed giants from the pages of the Bible. Something along those lines. And I can understand why you might look at tonight's subject matter and say, well, that's kind of bland and mundane. But we've dived into this whole subject of AI before, whether it's demonic or whether it's just another technology. But I think there's some obvious evils concerning AI that most folks just overlook. They're too busy out there looking for some kind of mystical, demonic, other realm explanation for it all. But there's actually a very real and present evil to AI. And that's what we're going to get into now. Because once you understand that artificial intelligence is not just software floating in abstraction, but instead a physical system rooted in infrastructure, electricity, land use, water consumption, manufacturing, and industrial scale computing, the next question becomes unavoidable. Why is it expanding at such a huge and rapid pace? Because nothing at this scale grows without pressure behind it. Nothing starts consuming more physical resources, more land, more energy, more construction capacity, more engineering labor, and more long-term financial investment unless multiple systems are pushing it forward at the same time. And in the case of AI and modern data infrastructure, there is not a single driver. There are multiple drivers, independent drivers, overlapping drivers, drivers that reinforce each other in ways that produce acceleration rather than balance. And when you step back far enough, what you see is not a single plan. You see a system of momentum. The first major force is competition. But this is not ordinary competition. This is not just companies trying to make slightly better tools or slightly faster products or slightly more efficient surfaces. This is strategic level competition. Artificial intelligence has become a foundational layer of economic development, information processing, and automation capability. That means it is no longer optional for major corporations or major governments. It's something they must engage with if they want to remain relevant in the next phase of technological development. You heard me. And once something becomes mandatory at that level, the behavior changes. No one is asking anymore whether they should participate. They are asking how fast they can scale before someone else does. That single shift, moving from optional development to mandatory participation, changes the entire structure of decision-making. Because now every delay is interpreted as risk. Every hesitation is interpreted as falling behind. Every moment of restraint is interpreted as potential loss of position in a rapidly moving field. So what happens is acceleration. Companies begin building infrastructure, not because it's fully optimized, but because it's necessary to remain competitive. They build larger data centers. They deploy more compute clusters, they purchase more specialized hardware, they secure more energy contracts, they expand into more geographic regions where land and power are available. And this is not happening in isolation. It is happening simultaneously across multiple corporations and multiple countries, which creates a feedback loop, folks. Because when one actor expands infrastructure, others feel compelled to match it. And when they match it, the baseline shifts. And when the baseline shifts, the next round of expansion starts from a higher starting point. This is how escalation works in industrial systems. Not through a single decision, but through repeated adjustments in response to each other's movements. And the physical result of that escalation is always the same. More infrastructure, more land use, more electricity demand, more construction. The second major force is economic pressure. Artificial intelligence is not just technological development. It is a financial narrative that has become deeply embedded into investment systems, corporate valuation models, and long-term economic forecasting. Entire markets are now influenced by expectations around AI growth. That's why everybody's so worried about the AI bubble bursting. Many of you might remember the dot-com bubble that bursted back in the 90s, beginning in the 2000s. You old schoolers out there will, at least. Companies are valued based not on what they currently produce, but on what they are expected to become within an AI-driven economy. That expectation changes behavior. Because when capital flows towards AI development, companies respond by increasing investment in AI infrastructure. And that investment is not abstract. It becomes physical. It becomes servers. It becomes data centers. It becomes chips, cooling systems, networking infrastructure, and massive electrical demand, as we've spoken of previously. And once a company commits to that level of infrastructure investment, it creates internal pressure to justify it. Large-scale infrastructure is expensive. It is not something you build and leave idle. It is something that must be used continuously to justify its cost. So there is this constant pressure to increase utilization, increase deployment, increase integration of AI systems into more and more parts of digital and economic activity. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Infrastructure leads to capability. Capability leads to more demand. More demand leads to more investment. And around it goes. The third major force is energy economics. And this is where the physical reality becomes very direct and unavoidable. Artificial intelligence systems consume enormous amounts of electricity, not intermittently, not occasionally, continuously. Every computation requires energy. Every server requires power. Every data center requires a constant electrical input to maintain operations, cooling, and network stability. And electricity is not evenly distributed. Some regions have abundant generation capacity. Some regions have limited capacity. Some regions can expand energy infrastructure relatively easily. Others face regulatory, environmental, or logistical constraints. So what happens is that AI infrastructure begins to concentrate in specific geographic zones where the conditions are favorable. These conditions include available land. You know, all the land that the government took away from public use. Stable energy supply, access to transmission infrastructure, and regulatory environments that allow large-scale industrial development. Over time, these regions become digital infrastructure hubs. Think Silicon Valley. Not because they were designed to be that from the beginning, but because they are structurally suitable for it. And once a region becomes a hub, it tends to attract more development, because infrastructure attracts infrastructure. Energy expansion enables more data center expansion. Data center expansion justifies more energy expansions, and both reinforce each other in a continuous cycle of regional development. The fourth major force is technological momentum. Once AI systems reach a certain level of capability, they begin to generate their own demand structures. More capable systems require more data to train. More data requires more computation. More computation requires more infrastructure. More infrastructure enables more capable systems. This is a recursive loop embedded into the system itself. And recursive loops tend to accelerate until they encounter external constraints. Those constraints might be physical, like energy limitations or material shortages. They might be economic, like rising capital cost. They might be regulatory, like environmental or zoning restrictions. Or they might be logistical, like supply chain limitations for critical hardware components. But until those constraints become binding in a significant way, the system just continues to expand along its existing trajectory. It's like the snake eating its own tail. It grows bigger and bigger while consuming itself. Never-ending cycle. And at the current stage of development, AI infrastructure is still very much in that expansion phase, which means demand is not stabilizing. It is increasing. And that increase is not purely human-driven. It is system-driven. Because the more capability that is built into AI systems, the more they are used. The more they are used, the more infrastructure is required. The more infrastructure is required, the more capability becomes possible. Now, when you combine these four forces, competition, economic pressure, energy economics, and technological momentum, you do not get a balanced system. You get a reinforcing system. And reinforcing systems do not tend towards equilibrium naturally. They tend towards expansion until something external imposes limitation. I've always thought of these man-made systems as what Revelation in the Bible referred to as the beast, Great Babylon. But I digress. That these are just four of the reasons why the physical footprint of AI is growing so rapidly. Because nothing inside the system is inherently designed to slow it down. Every major participant is optimizing for its own logic. Companies optimize for competitive positioning. Investors optimize for returns. Energy providers optimize for capacity and long-term demand contracts. Engineers optimize for performance and scalability. And of course, governments optimize to maintain power. And when all those optimizations align in the same direction, the result is not moderation, it is acceleration. Even without coordination, even without central planning, even without a single guiding authority, the system itself moves like a living organism in a direction that emerges from the alignment of incentives. And that is why expansion feels so consistent across regions and industries. It is not random. It is not accidental. It is emergent behavior from multiple systems interacting at a scale. And all of that still resolves into something very simple at the physical level. More buildings, more servers, more electricity, more land conversion, more cooling systems, more long-term integration of industrial computing into physical geography. And this is where the abstraction begins to collapse. Because at the user level, AI still feels like software, like a tool. It feels like something accessed through a screen. It feels instant. It feels weightless. But at the infrastructure level, it is none of those things. It is industrial expansion. It is energy consumption. It is a physical construction. And it is accelerating. It is eating, consuming, and growing. Which brings the conversation to its next stage. Because if this is what is driving expansion, the next question is what that expansion actually does when it enters real communities, real regions, real neighborhoods, real small towns, and physical environments where resources are not infinite and infrastructure is not neutral. And that is where the impact becomes visible. That is where the evil starts to become evident. Stick around, folks.
Well, you know what time it is. Every old country gathering had that moment. The basket made its way down the aisle. It's how the lights stayed on and the doors stayed open. These days, it looks a little different. If this video brought you any value, follow over on Rumble. Share it with someone who might need it. If you want to support directly, there's PayPal for a one-time gift, Ko-Fi for a few extras, and Patreon for the deeper content that doesn't always fit neatly here. And if all you can do is share it, that matters more than you think. Thank you. Truly. Alright, back to the show.
Alrighty, welcome back. Got your refreshments refreshed? Because I know all this technical lingo can get quite dry. So take a guzzle and let's get back into it. Because once you move past the question of why artificial intelligence is expanding, and you look at the forces driving that expansion, the next step is to look at what actually happens when that expansion reaches the physical world. Because at some point, all this stops being abstract. It stops being theoretical. It stops being about competition, markets, algorithms, or technological momentum. And it becomes something much more concrete. It becomes geography. It becomes infrastructure in real places. It becomes land being converted, power grids being adjusted, water systems being used, construction projects being approved, and long-term industrial footprints being established in communities that often had very little involvement in the decision-making process that led to those changes. And this is where the conversation becomes materially grounded. Because data centers and AI infrastructure do not exist in isolation. They are not floating systems disconnected from the world. They are physically embedded into specific regions, and those regions absorb the impact in very direct ways. In other words, they're physically in your neighborhoods, your towns, your cities, and the grounds of your towns and cities and neighborhoods are poisoned by their presence. Now, on the surface, the arrival of large-scale digital infrastructure is often presented as economic development. Jobs, investment, tax revenue, modernization, growth, and in some cases, those things are real, temporarily. There's always some level of construction employment. There is always some level of tax contribution. There's always some level of local economic activity generated by large infrastructure projects, obviously. But those surface level benefits do not tell the entire story. Because the more important question is not what is added temporarily during construction. The more important question is what changes permanently in the structure of a region once industrial-scale computing infrastructure becomes part of its landscape. And folks, the first major impact point is electricity. Artificial intelligence infrastructure is not passive when it comes to energy consumption. It's one of the most power-sensitive industrial systems currently being deployed at scale in modern economics. It's a hungry beast. These facilities require continuous electrical input, not occasional usage, not variable usage in response to demand fluctuations. Continuous high-load operation that must be stable at all times. That means they are not simply connected to the grid in a casual way. They become major participants in grid planning. In some regions, a single large data center can represent a significant portion of local or regional electricity demand. And when that happens, utility companies have to adjust their planning models accordingly. I don't know about your bills, but my electric bill has skyrocketed here in Bloomington, Indiana. Thanks, Big Data. That can include building new substations, upgrading transmission lines, expanding generation capacity, reconfiguring load distribution across the grid. All that has consequences that extend beyond the data center itself. Because electricity infrastructure is shared infrastructure. So when large industrial users enter the system changes for everyone. Sometimes that change is manageable and planned for. Sometimes it requires long-term infrastructure investment cycles that reshape how energy is distributed in an entire region. In other words, jacking up your electric bill to feed the AI beast. In all cases, the presence of large-scale computing facilities becomes a factor in how energy systems evolve. The second major impact point is water usage. Not all data centers use water in the same way, but many large-scale facilities rely on water-based cooling systems or hybrid cooling systems to manage the heat generated by continuous computation. Because heat is not optional in these environments, it is a direct byproduct of electrical and computational activity, as we discussed. And when systems run continuously at scale, heat becomes a primary engineering constraint. So cooling systems are not secondary. They are foundational. In some designs, water is used directly in cooling processes. In others, it is used indirectly through cooling towers and evaporative systems. In others still, air cooling is supplemented with liquid-based systems, depending on efficiency requirements and environmental conditions. Regardless of the exact configuration, the key point is that cooling at scale becomes a resource question. And in regions where water availability is already a managed or sensitive issue, the introduction of large industrial cooling demand becomes part of local planning discussions. This is not always visible in everyday life. It often happens through regulatory filings, environmental assessments, utility negotiations, and infrastructure planning documents. But the physical reality remains the same. Your electric bill goes up. Your water bill goes up. Cooling systems require resources, and those resources are part of the local environment. The third major impact point is land use transformation. Data centers require significant physical space, not just for the main building, but for the full operational footprint surrounding it. That includes electrical infrastructure such as substations. It includes cooling infrastructure. It includes security zones. It includes access roads, expansion capacity, and buffer areas designed to accommodate future growth. And once land is converted into industrial computing and infrastructure, that conversion is typically long-term. These are not temporary facilities. They are designed for multi-decade operation cycles. So the decision to build one is not just a construction decision. It is a structural land use decision. It determines what that land will be used for over a long period of time. And in many cases, the regions where this happens are not dense urban centers where land use competition is already extreme. Instead, they are often peripheral zones, rural adjacent areas, or regions where development pressure can be absorbed more easily, which means that the identity of those areas begins to shift. Gradually at first, then structurally over time. What was once primary agricultural land or undeveloped land or mixed-use land, small town suburbia, becomes integrated into industrial infrastructure networks that serve digital systems operating far beyond the local region. The fourth major impact point is environmental and infrastructural strain. Because once you introduce large-scale industrial computing into a region, it does not exist independently of everything else. It interacts with transportation systems due to construction and maintenance logistics. It interacts with energy systems due to continuous load demand. It interacts with water systems due to cooling requirements. It interacts with land ecosystems due to construction and expansion. And while each of these interactions might be individually manageable, the combined effect becomes more significant as the scale increases, especially when multiple facilities are built within the same general region, because infrastructure tends to cluster. Once a region is viable for development, more development tends to follow. Once energy capacity is expanded, it attracts additional demand. Once a grid is upgraded for industrial load, it becomes more attractive for additional industrial load. So what begins as a single facility can become a network of facilities. And what becomes a network of facilities can begin to reshape regional infrastructure priorities. At that point, the region itself begins to function as a part of a larger distributed computing system. Not in an abstract sense, but in a literal one. It's supplying energy. It is hosting hardware. It is supporting continuous computation that serves users who may be located anywhere in the world. And this is where one of the most important structural dynamics emerges. The benefits of the system are distributed globally, but the physical costs are localized. Small town America pays the price for global domination. Someone using an AI tool in one part of the world does not experience the electricity consumption in another region. They do not experience the water usage. They do not experience the land conversion. They do not experience the grid adjustments. They experience only the output, only the interface, only the result. And that separation between experience and infrastructure is one of the defining characteristics of modern digital systems, because it creates a kind of asymmetry, a separation between where value is consumed and where cost is absorbed. And that asymmetry is not accidental. It is structural. It is built into how distributed computing works at scale, because computation can be centralized even while usage is decentralized. And when that happens, the infrastructure supporting the computation becomes geographically concentrated, even though the user experience becomes globally distributed. Which means that certain regions carry a disproportionate share of the physical infrastructure burden relative to the global distribution of users. It's unfair. And that is not always visible in everyday awareness. Henceforth, we're talking about it right here, right now, because the system is designed to make the output visible and the infrastructure invisible. But invisibility does not mean absence. It simply means displacement of attention. And when attention is displaced long enough, systems begin to appear weightless, even when they are not. Now, there is another layer here that often gets overlooked, and that is the long-term structural identity shift of regions that become infrastructure hubs. Because once a region becomes integrated into large-scale digital infrastructure networks, it does not simply remain unchanged in all other aspects. Its economic profile shifts, its land use patterns shift, its infrastructure planning priorities shift, its energy investment priorities shift. And over time, it becomes defined, at least in part, by its role in sustaining external digital systems. That does not necessarily eliminate other forms of development, but it does change the balance of priorities. And those changes tend to be gradual, but persistent. Not sudden disruptions, but long-term structural adjustments. So when we talk about AI expansion, we are not just talking about new technology being deployed. We are talking about physical systems entering and reshaping geographical regions in ways that are often not immediately obvious at the surface level. And that is why this conversation matters. Because if you only look at AI from the perspective of user experience, you miss the entire physical substrate that makes that experience possible. But if you look at the physical substrate, the entire framing changes. It stops being purely digital. It stops being purely abstract. And it becomes something embedded in land, infrastructure, and resource systems that have real constraints and real consequences on us, living human biological organisms. And that brings the discussion to its next stage, Because once you understand what happens on the ground, the final question becomes what direction all of this is actually moving towards, and whether there is a point where these systems stabilize, adjust, or begin to encounter meaningful limits. And that's where the final segment begins. Stick around as we bring this bike home.
Way out past the county line where the old fields used to grow, they built a warehouse big as Babylon and lit it up with an electric glow. Power lines like spider webs stretching across the midnight sky. Transformer stations humming low like some machine that never dies. And the people in the city tap screens and never know how much earth it takes to build a thing that feels like smoke. There ain't no cloud, there's only steel and wire. Cooling towers, breathing heat, and engines burning high. There ain't no cloud, only concrete and code. A million servers blinking red out on forgotten road. River water pumping hard to cool the racks all night. Generators rumble deep under artificial light. Corporate men in tailored suits talk progress on TV, while another patch of countryside gets sold for electricity. And everybody wants it faster, everybody wants it free. Nobody thinks about the cost of digital infinity. There ain't no cloud, only cables underground. Fiber veins beneath the dirt, wrapped around every town. There ain't no cloud, only hunger without end. Every answer that you ask makes the machine grow again. You can hear it if you stand still long enough. That low electrical hum. Substations buzzing, cooling fans roaring. The sound of a civilization feeding a machine it barely understands. And the strange part is, most folks think AI lives nowhere, like it floats in the air, like it's magic. But magic don't need water, magic don't need power plants, magic don't flatten farmland and pull megawatts through steel veins in the ground. This thing is physical, real physical. Maybe someday smaller systems cut the footprint way back down. Maybe wiser heads will build a cleaner future for these towns. But right now the race is endless. Bigger grids and bigger loads, more black buildings full of silence out beyond the old back roads. And the machine keeps
late at night, when the whole world's asleep, the servers still whisper, and the lights never go out.
Welcome back, folks. Well, we've followed the thread all the way through, from the physical reality of infrastructure, to the drivers of expansion, to the ground level impact on real regions and real communities. The final question naturally rises to the surface. Where does this actually go? Because at this point, we are no longer talking about isolated developments. We are not talking about a few companies building a few data centers. I mean, look around, folks. We are not talking about a temporary technological trend that rises and falls like so many others. AI is here to stay. We're talking about a system that is embedding itself into physical geography, into energy infrastructure, into land use planning, and into long-term industrial strategy across multiple sectors at the same time. A many-tentacled beast. And when systems reach that level of integration, they tend to develop momentum that is not easily reversed. So the question is not just what AI can do today. The question becomes what kind of structure is being built around it, and what that structure implies for the future of physical, economic, and even social organization. Because once a system begins to require large-scale infrastructure in order to function, that infrastructure does not remain static. It evolves, it expands, it adapts into increasing demand, and it becomes part of the baseline assumptions of how society operates. That's where things begin to shift from technology into environment. Not natural environment in the ecological sense alone, but constructed environment, unnatural environment. The built world, these systems that surround daily life without most people consciously noticing them. And AI infrastructure is increasingly becoming part of that built environment. Now, there are a few possible directions this can go, and none of them are mutually exclusive. In fact, they may all occur simultaneously in different regions, under different constraints, and at different speeds. The first direction is continued expansion. In this scenario, artificial intelligence continues to scale rapidly. Demand for computation continues to grow. More applications are built on top of AI systems. More industries integrate automation. More consumer services rely on large-scale models. And infrastructure continues to expand to meet that demand. In that case, we would likely see even larger data centers, more concentrated infrastructure hubs, more aggressive energy planning, and more integration between technology companies and utility providers. Energy grids would become even more central to technological planning. Land use decisions would become even more tied to digital infrastructure requirements. And regions with favorable conditions for data center development would become increasingly important in the global digital economy. The second direction is decentralization. In this scenario, instead of continuing to build larger centralized infrastructure hubs, systems begin shifting towards distributed computing models. Smaller models run closer to users. Edge computing becomes more prominent. Processing is distributed across more locations rather than concentrated in massive facilities. This would reduce pressure on any single region, but it would also introduce new complexity in coordination, efficiency, and standardization. Decentralization is not inherently simpler. It often redistributes complexity rather than eliminating it. But it does change the physical footprint of infrastructure. Instead of massive centralized nodes, you get smaller distributed nodes embedded across more locations. The third direction is constraint-driven adjustment. This is the scenario where physical limitations begin to assert themselves more clearly. Energy grids reach capacity limits in certain regions. Water usage becomes more regulated in others. Land availability becomes more constrained in high-demand areas. Environmental regulations become more significant in shaping where and how infrastructure can be built. And supply chain limitations for key components, chips, cooling systems, electrical equipment, begin to influence the pace of expansion. We're already starting to see this scenario, and in this scenario, AI does not stop developing, but its physical expansion becomes more moderated by real-world constraints. Growth continues, but in a more uneven and regulated pattern. Now, the fourth direction is optimization and efficiency consolidation. In this scenario, the focus shifts from scaling raw infrastructure to improving efficiency of existing systems. Better chips, better cooling systems, better energy utilization, better software optimization to reduce computational load where possible. This would not eliminate the need for infrastructure, but it could reduce the rate at which new infrastructure must be built relative to computational output. And that matters, because efficiency gains can temporarily decouple capability growth from physical expansion growth, at least partially. Now, in reality, what is most likely is not a single one of these paths, but a combination. Some regions will continue expanding aggressively. Some will hit constraints and slow down. Some will experiment with decentralization. Some will focus on efficiency improvements. And the global system will become a patchwork of different approaches rather than a single unified direction. Kind of like the early days of the internet, and basically, it still exists as the World Wide Web. But regardless of which combination emerges, one underlying reality remains consistent. Artificial intelligence is becoming embedded into physical infrastructure at scale. And that means it's becoming part of the long-term structural landscape of industrial society. Not just as a tool. Not just as a software. But as a system. A living, growing, evolving system that requires continuous physical support to exist. Now, there is something important to say here that often gets lost when conversations like this become either overly optimistic or overly fearful. Systems like this are not inherently good or inherently evil in a simplistic sense. They are structured systems with trade-offs. They produce benefits, they produce cost, they redistribute resources, they change incentives, they alter patterns of development, and the effects are rarely evenly distributed. Some regions benefit economically. Some regions bear infrastructural load. Some industries gain productivity. Some communities experience disruption. And that's putting it lightly, folks. And those dynamics are not unique to AI. They are characteristic of industrial transformation in general. But AI is distinct in one important way. It is deeply tied to abstraction, because the user experience is abstract. You interact with it through language, through interfaces, through outputs that feel immediate and effortless, which means the underlying infrastructure is often psychologically invisible to the average user. And that invisibility matters. It matters a lot. Because when something is invisible, it is easier to assume it has no cost. And when systems are assumed to have no cost, they tend to expand more quickly than systems whose costs are constantly visible and felt. So one of the most important shifts that can happen in a conversation like this is not technological. It's perceptual. It is simply recognizing that digital systems are not weightless. They are anchored. They are supported. They are maintained through physical systems that operate continuously in the background. And that recognition does not require fear. It doesn't require rejection. It just simply requires clarity. Now, stepping back further, there is a broader philosophical question that begins to emerge when you look at systems like this over time. What happens when human societies build increasingly complex layers of infrastructure that most individuals do not directly see, but rely on completely? Because that's not unique to AI. Modern civilization already operates that way in many respects. Electric grids, water systems, transportation networks, communication systems, financial systems. Most people interact with outputs, not the actual infrastructure. AI is simply extending that pattern into a more computational intensive domain. And historically, when systems become more complex and more abstracted from direct visibility, they also become more dependent on trust and the stability of those systems. Trust that the grid works. Trust that the network functions. Trust that the infrastructure is stable. Trust that the systems behind the interface continue operating as expected. And that trust is usually not conscious. It's built into daily life through repetition and reliability. We put our trust into this man-made system of varying infrastructures. So, when we talk about AI infrastructure, we are also indirectly talking about trust in complex systems. Trust in the system. Not blind trust, but structural reliance. Now, from a biblical perspective, there is a grounding principle that becomes relevant here. Not as a political statement, or a technological judgment, but as a way of orienting perspective. Throughout Scripture, there's a consistent reminder that human systems, no matter how advanced, no matter how large, no matter how structurally impressive, are still finite. They rise, they expand, they develop complexity, and yet they remain within the boundaries of human limitation. There is a recurring pattern in Scripture of empires, systems, and human constructs reaching levels of perceived stability and permanence, only to eventually be shown as temporary compared to what is enduring. And the point of that reminder is not to produce fear or rejection of human development. It is to produce perspective. Because when human systems become very large and very complex, it becomes easy to assume they define the entire horizon of reality. It becomes easy to assume they are self-sustaining in an ultimate sense. It becomes easy to forget that they are still dependent systems built on resources, energy, labor, and conditions that exist within a larger order of reality. And the Bible repeatedly brings that horizon back into focus. Not to diminish human capability, but to place it in context. So when we look at something like artificial intelligence infrastructure, massive, expanding, deeply integrated into global systems, it is useful to hold both ideals at once. On one hand, it is a real technological and industrial development with real consequences and real impact. On the other hand, it is still part of a broader framework of human systems that are not ultimate in themselves. And that balance matters, because without it, you tend to drift towards one of two extremes. Everything becomes fear-driven and overwhelming, or everything becomes hype-driven and detached from consequence. And neither of those positions allows for clear thinking. What allows for clear thinking is recognition. Recognition of scale. Recognition of infrastructure. Recognition of dependency. Recognition of consequence. And recognition of limits. So, as we bring this episode to a close, the point is not to land on a single conclusion about AI. The point is to see it more accurately than the surface of narrative allows. To understand that what feels digital is built on what is physical. What feels instantaneous is supported by long chains of infrastructure. What feels abstract is anchored in geography and resource systems. And what feels weightless is, in reality, carried by industrial scale physical effort. And once that's understood clearly, the conversation can continue with more grounding, less distortion, and more awareness of what's actually being built underneath the surface of modern life. And that's where we'll leave it for now. But if you'd like to carry on this conversation and listen to this old man go a little off script into a full-blown rant, where we take a closer look at the actual effects of these large data centers and the often devastating impact it has on biological humans like you and I. Come join us over on the Patreon for the post-rant after show. I'm fired up and raring to go. But regardless, if you stuck around to the end, hit me up in the comments and let me know, because I know this episode is full of big 50-cent words and oftentimes dry and bland. But the overall picture I want to get across is these little things we take for granted, specifically with the rise of AI. It's just a tool, it's just another piece of software, it's just another thing that's on the internet. Well, just like the internet, just like television before it, just like radio before it, and just like the telegraph before it. Every technological advance has an equal and opposite negative effect on our actual physical environment. We're so busy going around getting all hooplaed on the hype here on YouTube, on Rumble, and social media about, the evils of AI, how it's a form of demonic entity. And I'm not saying that that's not possible. As a matter of fact, come back next week as we delve into that more interesting, for most people, aspect of AI and technology in general, the occult origins, the demonic influences, and the cosmic horror that lays before us with this birth of AI. Sounds dramatic, doesn't it? More like what you come here for to begin with, eh? Well, now that we've laid the groundwork of the actual physical, mundane, but still nonetheless evil of AI, I think we'll be more prepared to dive into the potentially spiritual evils of AI. What it is, where it comes from, what it wants. Alrighty. Well, thank you for joining me here tonight. Listen to this old man babble on in Babylon. If you enjoyed this here episode, and you must have, or you wouldn't have stuck around this long to get through all those dry branches, don't forget to do those things we'd like for you to do. If you're over on the YouTube, give us a little love with that thumbs up. Give us a like over on the Rumble. And no matter where you're at, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you're at, make sure you share. Share this here podcast far and wide. Share it with your friends, your family members, your co-workers, random strangers on the street, the guy that works at the taco shack down on the corner, the older couple that runs the bodega. Share, 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 and share alike. That's the best way you can help this here little podcast grow. Big shout out and thank you, as always, to my patrons over there. As of the recording of this video, my core 4. Big love and a shout out, and I'll see y'all here in just a few moments. As for the rest of you, I hope to see you here next time, and until next time, Abba willing. Shalom, shalom.
Shalom. In a world that seems to spin faster every day, where truth feels fragile, and anger fills the spaces where love used to live, remember this: God's light still breaks through the noise. It shines through every honest word, every act of mercy, every moment we choose prayer instead of pride. Nations will argue, kings will fall, but his kingdom, the one written not on paper, but on our hearts, stands forever. So keep your eyes on that light, keep your heart soft even when the world grows cold, and when the night feels long, just whisper, though I sit in darkness, the Lord will be my light. Until next time, keep the faith, keep watching, and keep riding toward the kingdom. Shalom.